Saudações. Vamos então ao tema de fundo preparado para esta edição. Como anunciado, vamos conversar relativamente à interação ou à cooperação ou à parceria entre o Banco Mundial e o Estado moçambicano, uma parceria que conheceu desenvolvimentos mais significativos recentemente na sequência do acordo do regresso ao apoio direto ao orçamento do Estado em termos concessionais pelo Banco Mundial, recentemente anunciado, 300 milhões de dólares, foi esse o entendimento a que se chegou, e estamos neste momento nos escritórios do Banco Mundial exatamente para aprofundarmos, entre outros, esse aspecto também e vermos o contexto desta nova parceria existente entre o Banco Mundial e o governo de Moçambique. Nesse sentido, está conosco a doutora Aida Psiroy-Riedel, que é a diretora do Banco Mundial para Moçambique, que cobre também Comores, Maurícias e Seychelles. Queria só deixar aqui uma ressalva e pedir também a vossa compreensão, porque vamos conduzir esta entrevista em língua inglesa. A senhora Aida ainda não está propriamente confortável em se expressar em termos de entrevista em português, pelo que peço esta anuência da vossa parte e que consigam seguir através da tradução direta que iremos fazer. Ms. Aida, thank you for having us here and accepting to give us this your premiere interview. I think
Yes.
In this term for our local media, and I will start for the most recent developments with regarding the partnership between the World Bank and Mozambican government. That this agreement that is finalizing the return of the World Bank to support the budget, government budget. What is the meaning of this for World Bank, in fact?
So first of all, I would like to thank you for giving us this opportunity. Really, I think it's fantastic for us to be able to communicate what the World Bank is doing, but also to share, and hopefully after this we can also hear from others what they think about what we are doing. Let me say that the World Bank has been in this country working since 1984, so we have a long relationship with
It's a long
Mozambique.
story.
And the budget support that you talk about was really one of those milestones that the World Bank has been very happy to be a part of in terms of supporting the government to get to that point. What does it mean? You'll remember that after the hidden debts, the World Bank stopped doing budget support, as did many of the other development partners. And a lot of it was linked to the need to stop and focus on transparency, governance, and debt management. How to bring all of this together to make sure you don't have a similar situation in the future. So us coming in now means that there is a lot of comfort in what the government has done to prepare the environment so that the institutions can actually better manage such a risk in the future. What do we hope will happen? We hope that other development partners will come to the table to start supporting the government. But we think this is also a very strong signal to the markets to say Mozambique is ready again to be supported on the budget support and to be able to go back to the markets with better ratings in the future to actually get better financing terms.
So I realize that World Bank is feeling confident this time these things will work out in terms of transparency and efficiency of using the funds allocated by World Bank.
So you know, I think that one of the most important things when you do this type of operation in the budget support is that you are actually preparing the terrain and you're consistently managing and checking and monitoring. Is it perfect? No. Is it stronger? Very much so. Is it actually going to reduce the risk of what happened in 2016? Very much so. So I think it's a process. That's why, if you remember, what we also said in that meeting was this is the first of 3 budget support operations. So this is just the start. We will continue to build on it, and then we will support the budget support with our investment projects. So it's a process, but it's a process that we are very happy to see at the moment where it is and where it's going.
6 years wasn't too much time without supporting the government budget.
No, because we didn't stop supporting the government at all. The World Bank uses different instruments. Budget support is just one instrument. In addition to that, we have investment. So let's take, for example, the sector in water. One, you can support reforms in water through the budget support. What does that mean? It means that the reforms are done first, and then you put the money in the budget. But you can also do the same things using investment projects. It takes a slightly longer time, and it's a different trajectory, but we are never away. We are just doing things differently.
Okay, the World Bank has just defined the Mozambique Country Partnership Framework. What is the meaning of this program in terms of economic assistance to the country?
So again, I'm very excited about the Country Partnership Framework. You know, this is an instrument we use all over the world in our countries that we support. And I think to understand the Country Partnership Framework is to understand, first of all, the principles. What are the principles of a partnership framework? It's jointly made with the government. It is consulted as widely as possible. It really focuses on reducing extreme poverty and inclusion of everybody in the society. But I think most of all, what we are looking at is that we take a look back. What did we manage to do in the last country partnership frameworks? What succeeded, what didn't? So for the things that didn't succeed, we try to figure out how to do them differently. For those that succeeded, maybe we try to do more of those and not less of that. So what does it mean actually for the government when we have a country partnership framework? It means a few things. The first thing is it gives the vision to the government, to the World Bank, to the development partners, what activities will be done over a 5-year time frame. It also gives a sense of achievements that need to happen in that time frame. So in addition to putting the money, we are also monitoring and we are adjusting as we go along. So it's a really important framework. Don't forget also that this framework is very much linked to the government's 5-year plan itself, and to the ENDE, and to many other sector reforms. So it's really an accumulation of knowledge and activities that come from a wide range of the government's portfolio. And then it looks and says, okay, we need to make priorities. What are we going to be good at that we should finance and lead, and what can other partners bring to the table? So it is a partnership. That's why we call it a partnership. It's more than just the bank or the government.
So, and then with regard with the country context and the recent developments, we talked a little bit at the beginning of our interview about that. What is the World Bank vision with the Mozambique Country Partnership Framework?
So I think before I kind of even talk about the vision itself, a couple of things that I want to talk about. One, which is, you know, when we look at the country partnership framework, we are sort of thinking, what's changed from the last time we had a partnership framework? What stayed the same? And then when we have that information, we say, how do we move forward? So let me give a few elements of what I think has changed since the previous. One is the insurgency in the north became much more than when we did our last partnership framework. There's been an intensity in cyclones. I mean, anybody and everybody sees what's been happening. COVID-19 came in. We now have the Ukraine crisis. Everybody is really feeling it in terms of the governments all over the world. But for Mozambique, what matters is, how do you use these new things and really work on them? What did we take from the last one? We know we need to still work on institutions. We know we still need to build resilience of the government to manage shocks, including people to manage shocks. The macroeconomic, that's where we started. You ask, what happened with the budget support? A budget support signals that the macroeconomic framework of the country is in good shape. If it is not, we cannot give budget support. So the idea is then to say, we know all of these elements, where do we want to go? And if you look at our country partnership framework right now, we are looking at three main things. One is the macroeconomic framework, as we talked about, and resilience. The other is how do we get more growth in the economy. The growth has slowed down a lot, but we never take our eyes off the issues of poverty and inclusion. So it's a big bucket that then gets drilled down to the actual activities at the end of the day.
And what is the trojans of this new World Bank program? The public opinion have been waiting for so long time for this return to the norm framework between World Bank and the Mozambican government, the Mozambican society as well, I can say. So what are the priority areas of this program?
So let me say that, yes, the World Bank stopped giving budget support, but our relationship stayed very strong with Mozambique.
It's never stopped.
No, and this is a relationship we treasure a lot, and we continue to want to look at it. And let me also put an aside. You know, we often hear that the World Bank is financing a regime. It's really important to understand how the World Bank works. And I think this is a very good opportunity for me to mention this. What the World Bank does is that we finance through governments all over the world. There is no exception to the way we manage the financing. The second thing is that we've been here since 1984. We've never stopped financing a single government since 1984. We have maintained our relationship. Why? There's one very simple reason. For the bank, what is most important for us is our finances work and deliver for the people in Mozambique, right? It's the people we try to get to. That's why I mentioned earlier the importance of institutions being strong. So what are the risks going forward? I'll mention a few. I think the most important risk for us that I see personally also is the demographic dividend in Mozambique. There is a huge population of young in Mozambique. And young people mean two things. One is that it means a lot of young people are having children very early. But it also means that you have a lot of children who are entering the school age, and there is no way the services can match the entrance into school. It also means that young women are no longer working in the labor workforce, right? Because they have to be looking after children. But because these families then tend to be poorer, it means that these children are also not doing well. They have malnutrition, they have a lot of other health issues. And I think that unless somehow the number of children born comes down a little bit, it's going to be very difficult to actually get ahead of the problem in Mozambique.
How do you help the government to address this?
I think, you know, people sometimes jump to the conclusion you need to tell everybody to. No, it's a process. Why is it a process? If we can keep young girls at school, they're not going to get married until they finish school. If we can give young girls potential to go and work, we can create services for them and jobs, they're not going to get married until they're ready. If we can create opportunities for the youth in general, the youth will have a lot of things that they need to focus on to become productive members of society. This is why it is so important to get ahead of the demographic dividend to create these opportunities. And there is no way we can do that without addressing this key issue. But a couple of other things that I think are also really important to watch that we see as risks, right? It's how quickly the institutions become strong. And why do I talk about this? You know, when you do reforms, you need institutions that implement the reforms so that the reforms matter and the reforms deliver results. The strength of the institution is almost directly proportional to the impact and the outcome you're going to get. The other issue that we also see is the number of shocks that continue to hit Mozambique. We think that, none of us can really ever create a situation where there is zero risk. So the question is, how quickly can we how quickly can we create a response system and resilience in the government and also in the people? So what does that mean in terms of our priorities? And I'm sorry to repeat this, but I really do want to emphasize the strength of the macroeconomic framework. Mozambique is at high risk of debt distress, which means that too many shocks could really make it go in the wrong direction. Mozambique is very vulnerable because of the debt that it carries already today. It needs to manage the risk and to actually be able to create fiscal space that allows it to manage a lot of the investments in the social sectors. And we are very concerned about human development. When you look at the numbers, now I'll just give you two numbers that have always kind of struck me. When you look at the number of children in the north, 90% of them cannot read or write at their age level. 50% of the women in the north cannot read or write. How do you develop enough to get these people to be in the society if they're not able to do? So there's a whole number of things we are doing, but these are the kind of things we are looking at, which is strengthening people, strengthening government, and creating space so that activities and investments can be done.
Well, moving forward, in terms of concessional financing support to economic recovery, Mozambique mainly relies on the support of the IMF and the World Bank to help narrow financing gaps. Mm-hmm. What is the relationship between the country framework partnership and the IMF program?
So here's the thing. It is true that the government does rely quite a lot on concessional funding, and that's a good thing. That's a very good thing, because if you look at
why make the country partnership framework conditional to the
approval
of the IMF program?
Actually, the country partnership framework is not conditional to the IMF. What is conditional is the budget support. So two very different. Our country partnership framework, actually, one of the strengths with that country partnership framework, as I was saying before, is that it actually involves not just the World Bank, but it's the World Bank, the IFC, and MIGA, and the others. It is not dependent at all on the IMF. What is dependent on the IMF is budget support. Why? In fact, I like to use the word, rather than conditionality in this case, I like to use the word interdependence. The IMF cannot lend without a strong macro framework. We cannot give budget support without a strong macro framework. That's why we work together. So while the IMF would kind of focus more on the short-term fiscal and external challenges, we then focus on the structural challenges. So we are interdependent in the way we work. But I reassure you, the CPF is definitely not dependent on the IMF.
So how the CPF address financing developments in short and medium term?
So, and for here, let me also pull in the issue of how much money, right? Because I know that this is always a question. So yes. How much is the CPF going to bring to the table, and then what's in the short term and the long term? So the way the way the allocation for Mozambique is determined, there's a few factors. One, and these factors affect all the countries we work on, right? The first factor is that it depends on the IDA replenishment. You know that the IDA fund itself is dependent on what donors put in the IDA. So if it's less, everybody gets less. If it's more, everybody gets a little bit more. The second very, 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 very important factor in what Mozambique gets is what we call the CPIA. That's the country. I need to always have to. The country performance institutional assessment, and it's really important why institutional, because this CPIA gives a rating. Every country is rated that depends on IDA. It is rated on the strength of its institutions, on the strength of its policies, to deliver and make the money they get work, and for the reduction of extreme poverty. This is really important. The higher the rating, the more the money. The lower the rating, the lower the money. At the same time, Mozambique is actually eligible to a number of different other windows. Just depends on their ability to get financing from those windows. Let me give you an example of one window which we call the Prevention and Resilience Allocation. Last fiscal year, Mozambique was able to get an additional $700 million. What does that actually mean? It means that when they get their usual allocation, this is a bump up to allow them to get the financing. The third thing that I want to put before I talk about the short term, these figures will change as we go into the future. Now is a good moment for Mozambique to attract as much concessional funding as it gets because, and we all want this to happen, Mozambique will grow, their GDP will grow, and they will no longer be eligible for these very low concessional funding or even the low rates of lending, of borrowing that they have. So what does this mean in the short term? Today, on the books, the World Bank has about $5.1 billion committed. And I say committed because it's important to explain. A commitment is not the same as a disbursement. So this money is in about 37 projects, and these projects go from 0 months to 6 or 7 years. This money is going to stretch over that length of time. And remember I said I was going to say a little bit about the fact that it said that the bank is putting a lot of money. When you calculate that this 5.1 billion has to stretch over 6 or 7 years, you see how small the amount of money is?
Yes.
Compared to what you need to deliver and to develop the country, that's the key. So then what we are doing in the CPF is to prioritize so that we have a good sense of how do we finance over time and how do we finance which activities to give the maximum benefit.
How aligned is the CPF with the National Strategy of Development that's running for with the government?
Very aligned. So the strategy for the government talks about transformational activities. It talks about growth, and it talks about sort of improving the livelihoods of people. And our strategy is exactly the same. We do the macroeconomic stability, so there's more money for the government to spend, and so therefore it can actually deliver for the people. We invest in infrastructure so that people can actually have a better standard of living. So they're exceedingly linked, and we always make sure that it links not only to the national strategy, but it also links to sector strategies, because you don't want to go into, for example, agriculture and not understand what the strategy is for agriculture. Sometimes the strategies don't exist, so we work collaboratively with the sector to create the strategy, and then we fund the activities. So in the short term, we expect to continue to put money, and you wanted the figures. It fluctuates, anything between $700 to $900 million a year. It can get to $1 billion if they are able to tap other windows. But again, as I say, it's not the absolute number that matters here. It's the fact that there's many different windows that they can tap going forward.
In terms of operationalization, the CPF adopt a project approach or the budget support approach?
Well, we like to have we'd like to have many different approaches. So we like to have budget support, we like to have investments. But the investments themselves, the investment projects also have other different ways in which the money can be dispersed. So let me give a couple of examples. So we have what we call a P4, that's a program for results. The way we implement that is that it actually has, in certain cases, results that the government needs to do at a reform level, which is very specific for the sector. When that reform is done, the money goes back to Treasury, almost like a small budget support. Then you have other activities where we pay once the activity has been done, and that is actually the regular, we reimburse the ministry. Or we implement the project year by year in the normal way. Why is it important to have different instruments and to have projects over a lot of time? Because you need to keep the cash flow going. You can imagine if you gave everything in 1 year, then what happens in the following years, right? So we try to make sure that it smooths out and you don't have
it's not a matter of trust.
There's trust. Of course, you should always trust your client and your partner, right? I mean, for sure, that's 100%. But we also, both sides, we have measures to make sure that what we are investing in actually is happening. So we do a lot of joint supervision missions. But also allow me to plug in one thing here. At the back of every single one of our projects, there's a phone number and there's an email. Anybody sees something that is not working on a specific project, we want to hear from you. Because when we don't get the information back, then we don't know. So yes, there's trust, there's checks and balances, there's a third party that we would like to see a lot more of. We want to hear. You triangulate.
You have learned from the past.
We are always learning. And I can tell you there are probably some lessons I'm going to learn for the next time, right? And the learning process is actually what makes the whole thing work. You can never have the answers. The one thing that makes me excited about development is it's exactly that. It is a process. Today you get something right.
We are always learning.
We're always making mistakes. Right. We are always learning, and hopefully we are always adjusting. So it's good.
The CPF also addressed a specific issue relevant to the Mozambican economy. In your opinion, what's the program vision regarding resilience and the natural resources?
So on the, one thing that actually Mozambique sometimes doesn't get recognized for is the work they have done in this area on disaster risk and climate change. I worked here in Mozambique about 13, 14 years ago, and at that time we were already talking about disaster risk management. Today, let me give you a few things that are actually there, that are functioning and that are working. One is in INGD, you now have a fund which allows the government to respond to disasters in real time, but also allows them to prepare. So the money can be used to prepare for disasters, and the money can be used to respond to disasters. This is more than many countries in Africa have today. This is an important milestone. The other thing that we have learned, you talk about lessons that we have learned, is that you need to address resilience also for the communities, not just resilience at the budget level. And so we are working with communities to train them, but also many of them have natural coping mechanisms that we also want to know and to learn about. We have been working a lot on the building standards. If you look at what happened to Beira in the last big cyclone, and you look at what happened to Beira a year ago, it's different. Why? Because we've upgraded a huge amount of the infrastructure, right? So we know that this is really critical. Mozambique has invested a lot. It's not always very well known. They're not out of the woods yet, right? There's still challenges, but they've done a lot to make a very solid basis.
Well, since the creation of the CPF, it has functioned as an important instrument for guiding the World Bank Group support to the country, to the Mozambique in this case. What are the most important lessons from the previous CPF?
So I think, we've learned a lot. And if you remember, I started with what has changed. And what has changed has been actually the most important teacher for us, right? In the way we think about our CPF, but also how we think of our program. So I think the most important thing we have learned is we need to be flexible. Yes, while we need to have a 5-year vision, things change a lot in 5 years. So maintain some level of flexibility so when things change, we can adapt. Let me give you a couple of changes that we have made. The most important is today when you look at all of our projects, they have a contingency fund. Why? Because we know things happen. And so when a disaster happens, a cyclone, or even when COVID happened, we were able to go and tap that fund to be able to finance a bit more. We've also learned that we need to do a lot more in agriculture. And I think the question for us is not, should we put more money in agriculture? We know we should, but the question is, what are we going to do differently? Agriculture is such a potential for this country, but still needs a long way to go. We think that it's important to create value chains. But for real value chains to work, a farmer needs to be able to take their product to the market. So we need to think about secondary roads. We need to get the private sector to come to the table to support and to work with the communities, otherwise it's not going to work. But most importantly, we need to develop extension services. Without extension services, you actually are not sharing the information in real time. We've also learned, as I was saying earlier, that institutions need to be stronger. The first and foremost responder to any crisis is the institutions. The question is, are they able to? Some yes, some not. And this is where the effort really has got to go. And the last one is what I was saying to you about the page, the last sentence in all our projects, which is the feedback mechanism. We are learning that it's really important that there's a strong feedback mechanism from the people who are benefiting, from people who are affected, and we would like to use all sorts of different ways of doing it. Third-party monitoring, including also sourcing information directly from people. But the point here is that we want to be very open and we want to hear the good, the bad, whatever the information is, because that's the only way we are going to develop. So, and the last thing that we've learned is prioritization matters. When you have an an institutional situation which needs developing, we in the bank also only have a certain number of people. Communities meet us, talk to all of us at so many different. We don't want to create fatigue in the system.
Okay.
So we need to do bigger projects, but fewer. So that we can really focus, and maybe there'll be more multi-sector rather than just having agriculture. Maybe we do agriculture with
more
water.
Efficiency, more effectiveness.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Absolutely important. But never take our eyes off the cross-cutting themes. Gender. We need more women's empowerment. Otherwise, we are not going to get there. Climate change. This country is so vulnerable. Citizen engagement, we need people to talk to us. We need to hear from them. And we want to focus also on the private sector and public and private sector participation. If we don't do this, frankly, the amount of money that's on the table from all of us is never going to be adequate. But what does that need? It means that the government is going to have to move out of some spaces where they are today to create room for the private sector to come in. And the very last thing that we've learned, and something we've seen over the last, is that the SOEs need work. There's huge losses that are going on today in many of the SOEs. They need reform. Believe me, these are not easy reforms. There will be winners, there will be losers, but the aggregate of doing this means everybody wins. And those tough reforms just have to get done. And I would say that's a really critical lesson for us.
We are getting closer to the end of this conversation, very interesting interview, I may say. So the last question I would like to address is the idea of how the World Bank have been contributed for the transformation of the different societies, countries, where it has been supporting the development process. In case of Mozambique, what examples there are of the transformation with support and partnership of the World Bank?
Thank you very much. And I will give you some elements, but let me also say that the World Bank, our strength is to leverage other development partners. So a lot of what we do with other development partners. And second of all, we don't implement projects, right? So we help the government get the financing, work out what the project will look like, what are the phasing of the project, and then the money comes. Having said that, let me outline a few things that I think many people out there will actually have a sense of. The first one is, you remember after the cyclone in Beira. Beira was completely destroyed. And the whole system of the drainage system out of Beira was a problem. We then went in with other partners and we have strengthened that whole system. When the cyclones came through last time, you saw how minimal the damage was. Another example is all of the upgrading that we've done to schools and to hospitals. Again, in the last cyclones, you will see that the effect was actually very much reduced. Why? Because the standards are different. And in fact, now, if you look forward, we're no longer going to build in these vulnerable areas at the standard of the one before. We are now going to use the new. What's the impact of that? Imagine everybody, the government, the development partners, any other partner that's going to come in and they improve the standard of the building, the impact is going to be phenomenal. But there are two more that I really want to put on the table because I think these really show progress that the World Bank with other partners have actually been instrumental. One is on energy. You know, no country can develop without energy. It doesn't matter how rich it is or how it cannot. Energy is the basis of, and it's the motor of development. Before the World Bank was actually really working in the energy sector here, the penetration rate was about 20.5%. Once the World Bank started to work here and really start to put financing in the sector, two things happened. The penetration is now at 35%. Am I happy with that? No. 35% of the population having electricity is not good enough. We need more. And that's the reason why recently we have been investing in the Temane project, which I'm sure you've heard about, with a lot of other development partners. That's going to be a game changer for Mozambique going forward. One other is, you know, Korumana Dam. The World Bank actually invested in Korumana Dam. Why? Because we knew that together with some of the other water projects we were working on, we would reach a huge number of vulnerable communities. It's the same. You may be able to live without electricity, but sure, you cannot live without clean water. It's impossible. One last example. At the height of COVID, a lot of families fell into poverty. These were informal workers who just could not cope because there was nowhere to sell. The restrictions were very high. The World Bank, we went and we actually took resources and put it into cash transfers. So people had some cash in their pockets to be able to go forward. Today, we know that with the increased expectation to 1 million more people who need to receive this, we need to put at least another $75 million this year. That's what we're working on right now to make sure. So the impact, I can go on and on with the number of projects that have had an impact. But let me close again by saying I would be very uncomfortable to have the World Bank take all that credit by itself. There are other development partners, there are institutions here in Mozambique that are working on this, and there are the populations themselves who are also participating. It's a partnership. And if there is a good moment to stress that, it's now when we are talking about the importance of a country partnership framework.
Aida Rido, I hope I have spelled very well your
Perfect.
Thank you for this interview, for this conversation. We hope to come back later to assess the developments of the different issues at very, very different topics we have talked about, to go topic by topic probably, to see how the things are working out.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. And let me say, you will not only be welcome, you will be very welcome. We would look forward to talking to you again, and not only to have the opportunity to express a little bit more what we are doing, but your questions also tell me about what Mozambicans are thinking about, and that's very important for us. Thank you.
Thank you. E fizemos assim esta entrevista de fundo, esta entrevista estruturada com a diretora do Banco Mundial para Moçambique, onde passamos em revista uma série de aspectos relativos ao novo engajamento do Banco Mundial com o país, o novo contexto do chamado parceria, o Country Partnership Framework, que é o quadro de parceria de país, que é um instrumento que o Banco Mundial usa para nortear o seu relacionamento, o seu apoio aos países, no caso vertente Moçambique, que são aspectos que iremos nas próximas ocasiões olharmos em detalhe ou no específico cada um desses tópicos no terreno para ver como é que realmente estas coisas, estes assuntos estão-se a passar efetivamente e qual o impacto que está a ter nas comunidades, nas pessoas, nas empresas, nos indivíduos e na economia no geral. Foi um prazer e obrigado por nos acompanhar. Até uma próxima oportunidade.